So thank you all for being here today. Hopefully, as we move forward with this, eventually we'll get a microphone out here so that it picks y'all up, so the conversation. So until then, we may repeat some things y'all said. So glad to see everybody today as we are going to continue digging through the Sermon on the Mount. And I really love that where we are right now, walking through the fulfillment of the law and where we're going Sunday, and it's just lining up perfect. So looking forward to tonight, but really looking forward to how God's going to combine the two on Sunday. So we're going to open in a word of prayer, and then we will get started. I am going to ask Brother Charles, will you open us in a word of prayer? Amen. So before we take off, we will be in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 is where we're going to start. But as we get ready for that, I just want to bring us back to that moment and kind of remember what's going on here. Jesus is at a place where he's in an elevated position on the side of a hill with what's that water that's out in front of him a little ways?
You talking about the Sea of Galilee?
Thank you. And the Sea of Galilee out a little ways, and there's some cities up on hills and things like that away. And Jesus is sitting here walking through some things that are some of the most important things that we can learn from. And this is Jesus' longest sermon in which he ever did was this time. And he's walking through this and he's talking to people. You know, as we said, some people believe that it was his disciples, but he didn't even have all his disciples, the 12, gathered up at that time. It was the disciples of just simply the people who were following Jesus, wanting to know more, but weren't fully invested yet. So, and he's also, you know, speaking through this with, there are religious leaders in the area and things like that that are catching things too. So it's important to know that, especially with what we're about to read. So we're going to take off in verse 17, and I'm going to read a little bit, and then we're going to stop and talk. It says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come in to abolish, but to fulfill." Let's just stop right there, one verse in. I love the way it's worded in the NASB. It says, "Do not think that I came to abolish it." Others say,
"Think not that I have come to destroy the law."
Right, come to destroy. Because there's this mindset that Jesus came and what he did is he wiped it away. He just did away with it. Well, if he did that, then God would be an unjust God.
Yeah. Well, and also if there was, for him to come to abolish the law would then state that there was no need for Christ himself. Because if there's not something, I mean, if he came to abolish it or to destroy it, then that's then saying that there was never a need for it, or there
Right.
was, what perfect sacrifice is there if you have nothing to measure the sacrifice up against? Right. And so...
Well, and he created these things with the intention, this law, for us to do our best to live up and be obedient to what God's calling was on our life, but he also allowed sacrifices and things like that because he knew that it was impossible. So here it is, and God upholding that law makes him a just God. Because if he didn't uphold that law, then he would not be a just God, which then that goes into a whole nother side of looking at the deity of who God is. You know, it does away with, you know, you take away him being a just God, then is he a good God? You know, right. There's so much depth to that, but we're not going to go there. But it's something you can look into more. But the significance here of him being a just God, he didn't just go, okay, let's erase the tablets, let's erase these things, and let's just start over. No, he still had to fulfill it. And I also love the fact of Jesus coming to fulfill that law, but it also says, or of the law or the prophets. But because it's also saying it's a connection there where a lot of the leaders that were around, the Jewish leaders, their mindset was always on the law and on the Torah. Jesus here is saying, I came not only to fulfill the Torah, but the whole canon.
Right.
Came to fulfill everything, the prophets, the prophecy that has been spoken. I've came to fulfill the law, that it would be fulfilled so that you could move forward. I came to be that sacrifice.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and again, and it talks about just in that next phrase, not in the next verse, but the next phrase, I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
right,
And them being both the law and the prophets.
right,
So like you said, he's not just saying that he has come to fulfill the law, but he's also come to fulfill all of the prophecy that came after the law, which again goes back to the fact that we know the law was given because God is just. And
right.
so there's only one man that could fulfill the law, and that's the guy that's talking to us right now.
Well, and I love personally sitting here in that place where looking at this from from my perspective. Imagine being sitting there while Jesus is sharing this, because they all are familiar with the law. They're all familiar with prophecy. And a lot of these people may have very well been the people who didn't acknowledge that he was the Messiah when he was with his birth and so on,
Right.
and missed out on a lot of these things. And some people were there listening because they had an idea that he was. And now here he is claiming, I came to fulfill the law and all prophecies you've heard. Now, to me, that would set me back in my chair a little bit.
Yeah.
Which is where, this goes back to that whole idea of people said, Jesus was either the Son of God
Or completely crazy.
or a raving lunatic. I mean, and that was the two options that we had, because the things in which he said, because when he says this, he's announcing his deity as well.
Yeah.
He's announcing that he is the Son of God. He's announcing, I am the Messiah.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's so little there, but there's so much, because they knew of the one that was coming to fulfill, the one that was coming to save, which they thought about it a little bit differently than what Scripture actually said.
Right.
But keeping that in mind, what are y'all's thoughts? What are y'all, from just that first verse and looking at that, can you imagine sitting there when this is going on? Not everybody at once. We want to be able to make out who's talking.
My Bible here is a living word, and it says, don't misunderstand why I have come. It isn't to cancel the law of Moses and the warning of the prophets. No, I come to fulfill them and to make them all come true.
Yeah.
And that's what, understand. Don't misunderstand what he's saying because of the words he uses.
Right. Don't get it misunderstood.
Found it interesting. I'm a huge reader, and in the book To Kill a Mockingbird, the youngest child scout is explaining that her father why he felt the need to always be within the law no matter what. And what she was saying is that he said that if he was breaking the law, he couldn't even tell her to go to bed on time, because if he wasn't following the rules,
Ooh, you're getting into
everybody
Sunday.
else.
She's getting into Sunday. Yeah, I'm glad. It's exciting because where you're going, I mean, and that's going to run right along with where we're continuing in James, which I won't get into that. But yeah, that fact of
That if you don't
he being a lawbreaker.
says, you can't tell other people.
That's right.
Jesus couldn't stand there and say, I'm not going to listen to this law, but y'all have to.
Right.
Yeah.
do it.
Any,
I'm sure this is another time, another day, but is man's law not anywhere near
God's law and man's law are two totally different places. But we are also called to acknowledge the law of man as long as it doesn't interfere with the law of God. So render unto Caesar what Caesar's, acknowledge those that are in authority above you, and so on. So, but yeah, and that's one of those things like we've been talking about Jesus flipped everything upside down because they had their own law. I mean, matter of fact, they had their own laws, and that's where the Israelites that were following God's law and the Egyptians and all these others that were following a different law, where the clash was and where there was so much tension, was because they were following the law of God, and in their country that was okay, but with others around it was not. Or while in Israel, or while in Egypt, the Israelites in Egypt in captivity, they were obeying the law, but yet they were still obeying the law of God, and it caused tension in their lives, and ultimately people died. You look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were called out to be obedient to the law, but yet when it came down to it, that law told them they couldn't obey the law of God. They couldn't bow down to God and do as they had been called to. And they went, well, in this moment, I'm sorry, I'm going to break your law to follow God's law.
Yeah.
So,
And just you touched on it, but that's why I think Jesus makes it so important in all three, and it's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the account of rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's, because they were in a time that Caesar was God to the Romans at the time. I mean, he was the ruler and the king, exactly. And so that's why they were trying to catch Christ at that time to come against Caesar. They thought they couldn't take Christ down based on their own beliefs and their own religious law. So they said, well, let's get him based off of what the Romans believe. Let's let him come against Caesar, and then they'll have a reason to arrest him. And so that's why they came to him and said, who do you pay your tax to? Do we pay tax or do we not? Blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, let me see the denarius, and it's got a picture of Caesar on it. And that's when he makes the comment, render to Caesar that is Caesar's, and to God that is God's. He's acknowledging that if, though there is a law of man and there is a law of God, and we live in a world where we have to obey the law and render to the law what is the law, and render to God what is God's. And I think that's one. There's a lot of other reasons why I think that's there, but I think that's a really important reason where he's pointing out that there is a separation there, but still a respect and a I don't know if respect is the right word, but you're
submission
acknowledging
to authority.
Yeah, there's still an authority there, and we live under that authority. But ultimately, we all live under the authority of God. And so when one intercrosses with the other, God comes first.
Yeah. Which I love which totally off subject, but you are okay with that, right?
Yeah.
This is yes, this is no, this is I don't know. Okay, great. All right, Craig says I don't know. But I love that fact that so many people look at the render under Caesar what's Caesar's. They think we're talking money and money alone.
Oh, right, yeah.
It's simply submitting to the rules of the authority over you more than just necessarily the funding.
Yep.
I've had people go, well, that's why I pay my taxes. It's like, okay, good.
But
But
you pay your taxes because if you don't, they're going to come take everything you own. That's why you pay your taxes.
Yeah, that's also why you don't run a red light. That's also why you're obedient in this. That's also why it's surrendering under the authority that's over you. Because if our authority tells us the speed limit's 55, but God didn't give us a speed limit, does that mean that we can do what we want? No. God didn't say, so we follow the rule of the land, the law of the land. So.
Yep.
Back in those days, they had their problems with the law.
Yes.
Now we're starting to see it with the same-sex marriage and telling the churches what they can do
Right.
and can't do. So we're back in that situation.
We are. And in that, same thing. We are to surrender unto the law of the land until it comes to a point where it goes against God's law. And that's where we as believers are to take a stand and go, okay, I'm going to follow your law, I'm going to do, but I am not crossing this line.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not crossing this line because my God said that it's unholy. It's not going to glorify him. But in simple laws that aren't addressed, which that's a whole nother ballgame in itself, everything that we can ever talk about in this world is addressed in this word. You just got to find the roadmap for it. But when we talk about this idea of things that we don't see as addressed or whatever, and surrendering under that, we have to be mindful that as we're doing that, the only way we're going to know if it goes against God's law is to be in the Word of God, which going back to Sunday where we're heading, which
Yeah.
I knew this was going to happen. I was afraid of it. But anyways, uh, when we're going in that direction, you know, and which what we're going to talk about Sunday, you are going to get a bit of it, but in James too, where it's talking about that if you've broken one piece of it, you're a lawbreaker of all.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what's going on here. Is he came in to fulfill the law because everyone there was a lawbreaker. Y'all get that?
That's right.
Well, I was saving that for Sunday, Craig. I've got to leave. Don't
Yeah.
make me do a new sermon for Sunday. Yeah.
I may be straying away a little bit, but something that come up that just, my mind went.
Okay.
But same-sex marriages,
Uh huh.
homosexuality, I mean, it clearly states it's not acceptable,
Mm-hmm.
but judge not lest you be judged.
That's right.
How do you accept it, or how do you not accept it?
Well,
without-
that's
The same way in which we accept someone who's living their life in adultery, running around.
I do.
It's that thing of accepting the person, not the sin.
Yeah.
And that's what I've talked with the deacons. You know, if we have someone that comes to our church that's a homosexual, we will welcome them as an individual. We will teach them and let them grow that God may show them their sin. But there's a fine line between that and taking in a couple, because that's a different story in itself. So it's that idea of seeing what God intends, because we're all sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God. But we have to love them, but not condone what they're doing. In the same way, anyone's sin that's in this room, every one of us in here have sin in our life. We can't condone that, but we have to love those people in spite of.
I've got family members,
Mm-hmm.
homosexuals.
Mm-hmm.
I love them very dearly, and always welcome in my home.
Mhm.
Then again, please don't push your beliefs on me, and I won't push my beliefs on you. And it's really hard to accept the relationship, but I love the individual.
Right. We have to do just as Jesus loves them as a person, he hates their sin. And
just
that's
as
what
much
we
so
have to
as
do.
the person sitting next to them that's an alcoholic, though.
Yes.
I love that person, but I do not love that they
Yeah.
drink themselves to death. Or the person that's on cocaine, or the person that's on, whatever other sin, the liar, the sinner, gluttonous,
Yeah.
the fat guy sitting next to you. That used to be me. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's all sin is sin, and we condone all sin. But we love
we don't condone all sin.
sin, not sinner, is what I'm saying.
Right. You said we condone sin.
Well, we don't. God,
Yeah.
we love the sinner is what I'm saying. You don't love the sin, and I hate
Right.
that saying, don't love the sin, love the sinner. But ultimately, it is about loving people,
Yeah.
not what they have or have not done, because ultimately, every single one of us is screwed up. And every one of us continues to screw up every
We
single
do,
day.
and it
So-
goes back to the speck in your eye, or the speck in their eye and the plank in your own.
Mm-hmm.
It's walking through that of the only way that we can minister to someone who is in sin is to acknowledge our own sin and go, I'm right there with you, brother, but I've been called to make you aware and to help you to walk through this. So, anyways. All right, so let's move on. It says it did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. So we all have a good idea of what we're talking about here, right? About him coming in, fulfilling that law, and and fulfilling the prophecy, which, like I said, we could go a long ways there, just simply looking at the prophecies that were spoke, and now he is there, and he has fulfilled most of them at this point, and he's about to fulfill the remainder of them.
Mm-hmm.
So. Well, in about 2.5 years, because this is early on in ministry. All right, Billy, take off.
Verse 18, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished.
Yeah.
So he's saying, and I love it. Anytime you see Jesus say, "For truly I say to you," and you'll see it also sometimes in King James, "Verily, verily I say to you." Anytime he says something like that, this is, pay attention. This is a very
Yeah.
important, I mean, everything in red letters is very important. But when he says something like, "I truly say to you," this is typically something, okay, he's fixing to say something really important. And until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. So until earth has passed away, what I have people, just like you said earlier, that will come and say, well, because what Christ did, Christ came and he fulfilled the law, and so now we no longer live under the law, and so on and so
Yeah.
forth, so I can have my bacon, and I can, I can do all these things. And I say, well, has earth passed away yet? I mean, are we still sitting here on earth? And Jesus clearly says, until heaven and earth pass away.
Well, and those are two things that when they would say that and put those two things together, it's showing that because heaven is eternal and the earth in itself, now not the inhabitants and not the, but is eternal, you know. So the earth will be, in literally unless a star hits it and explodes. But from what I'm reading here, that's probably not going to happen, okay? So Armageddon is a false myth. Well, Armageddon, the movie, anyways.
Yeah.
So,
Bruce Willis and-
but where he says here that truly, truly, I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, they're never going to. Heaven and earth will never be gone. So he's saying, until this happens, not even a letter or a stroke of a letter or a iota, or
Yep.
there's so many different things that different translations used here, but will not be taken away. Why would he make it so clear that this law in which we're talking about, not a stroke of it's going to disappear?
Because his laws never pass.
Because what?
His laws never end, never disappear.
Because if it went away, it goes back to he is a what?
Crazy person.
Or an unjust God.
Unjust.
That law will never go away. So until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until it is all accomplished.
Does anybody ever know why God gave us the law? Anybody ever do what? Guidelines.
Guidelines.
Right.
But what was the
But
intention of the
What's the
guidelines?
intention of the guidelines? I don't know if you're going to go the same way I'm going.
I am, yeah.
So you wouldn't be adding on to them and on to them.
Yeah, but what was his intention to it?
Like,
With,
why-
with that law, what was the reason in which he gave it? Yes, it was to give us guidelines and all that stuff, but what was the purpose of it?
let me give you a little hint.
Yeah.
Who created the heavens and the earth? God. So who ultimately knows how it should work? God. So the whole purpose of the law is for God to give us the guideline of, hey, this is how it works. This, in order to have the utmost in life of how I, the Father, created it, here are the guidelines to follow in order that life will be at your fullest if you follow all of these laws.
And that even extends into us, that those laws and guidelines were that we would live in harmony, bringing us back into harmony with him. He gave those so that what he created would operate in the way it was intended, even to the point of us as his creation would be brought back to him. Because, Old Testament, how they followed the law and they realized they were lawbreakers, and what they had to do? They had to atone, which, how'd they do that? Blood sacrifices.
Blood sacrifice, all sorts of different
Yes,
things.
there
Blood
were
sacrifices, there was
Grain sacrifices. Yeah, there.
there was
Plus how many other things were added to the law.
Yes.
right.
And the same way with nowadays Christians on salvation. People say you have to quit smoking, quit drinking, whatever.
Right.
We're working that into the law saying
Yeah.
that you can't be saved.
That's not law, that's religion.
Well, and here's what I love about this, because right now what we're reading and what we're seeing and everything, if you pay close attention, it says, till heaven and earth pass away. That's not happening. It's not going to happen. So these laws are in effect, right? Which makes every one of us a what? And a lawbreaker. Every one of us. We're going into Sunday. I knew this was going to happen.
Not to, but anyway.
So here we are, lawbreakers, and he says, "From none of that shall pass away from the law until it is all accomplished." What does that word? What does that all accomplished mean?
Fulfilled.
Are we kind of going in the area that the laws were basically, I can't even think of a way to say it, but basically a sign of obedience, and that you needed to,
It was more than obedience. It was, but this, huh?
God's time frame was achieved.
Which was what? No. Here, until from the law until it is accomplished. Till what's accomplished?
It's not, to me, it's not the end of the earth. So it's when you cease to exist on earth.
It's the accomplishment of when we are freed from the law. And that happened when?
What was the last thing Christ said
Yeah.
on the cross? It is finished.
It's finished.
It is complete. The work that he came to fulfill was completed at that moment when he died, took his last breath, and gave up his spirit.
Right. So the law is still there. It will not pass away, but Jesus fulfilled it and accomplished it that we could be freed from it. I see wheels spinning. Yeah, are you catching that? That where it says until it's accomplished, it's not going away, but it's fulfilled, which gives those who believe in Jesus Christ are freed from the law. Y'all, I marked this because I knew we were going to go here. 1 Corinthians 9:19. Uh-huh. Okay.
A new heaven and a new earth.
Yeah. Yeah. She's going into a whole nother ball game. Huh? You're not hung up on that one? You am hung up. She am hung up on that one. So that was a way in which they explained what was happening, that it was not going away, it was sticking.
So yes, there will be a heaven and earth, but there still will be a heaven and earth. That's what Jesus is saying here, that until heaven and earth pass away, which we know will never happen because there will be always a heaven and earth. That it may be a different earth, a different heaven, but heaven and earth will never pass away. And so the people that are listening, right, so you got to understand the people he's talking to right now. So again, you have to think about, we can take this and take Scripture and make it kind of form to what we kind of want it to think about, but you also have to take it for who's actually listening and the situation he's in right now. He is sitting on the side of a mountain talking to a lot of non-educated people, some Pharisees and Sadducees, people that know the law. They don't know anything much about what's to come as far as Revelation goes, because John has not even written the book yet.
Right.
So they're not familiar with the end times. They're not familiar with, so Christ obviously is, he's aware of all things because of him being God, but he's saying until heaven and earth pass away. So as far as these people are concerned, heaven and earth will never pass away. And Jesus knows heaven and earth will never pass away. There will always be a heaven and an earth.
And you're stuck on the specific, this earth in which we're on.
That heaven.
But there will always be a heaven and an earth.
Yeah.
Yes.
There will be, that is easy.
Okay. Are you ready? Are you good to go to the next part? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
You
So
get it? Are you with it now? Okay, because he's referring to it in that manner, and he didn't go this earth. It wasn't like this dirt shall never pass away. Does
Right.
that make sense? It's the heaven and the earth.
So where else is jot and tittle written in the Bible?
Do what?
Jot and tittle
That's what I meant too.
in Revelation, is it mentioned again?
The iota or a dot or the jot or tittle, however it's King James's
Oh,
jot and
okay.
tittle. Yeah.
I was going
Sorry.
jot or tittle. What?
Yeah. In King James, instead of saying iota, not a dot, it says not a
Okay.
jot or a tittle.
Okay.
For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled.
Yeah, yeah, because the tittle was, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because that's what actually would connect letters to make it,
Correct. Yeah. Yep.
to
yep.
make it a word. Yes, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
With
Letters
translation.
and words and things. Yeah.
Yeah. But I couldn't make out what you were saying back there at first. I was like, somebody help. Can I phone a friend? So not that I'm aware of, but I'm not saying it's not. All right, it's not in her concordance. I'm enjoying they're actually talking.
Yeah.
This is
I like
great.
this.
So where I was going a while ago, it's all right. Where I was going, because until it's accomplished, and the idea of the accomplished was that he came and freed us from the law. We're all aware of that, right? Because when you look at 1 Corinthians 9:19, it says, this is Paul speaking, he says, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as the Jews, so that I might win the Jews. For those that are under the law, I always have trouble reading this because it's da-da-da-da-da-da. To those who are under the law, as under the law, not being myself under the law, so that I might be able to win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without law, through though not being without the law. But can you read that, Billy? Because
Yeah.
I am.
You want me to paraphrase it?
Well, I was wanting to actually
Yeah.
read it right there.
What is
I
it?
always
1 Corinthians what?
Yeah, 1 Corinthians. That I don't know why, because it's with the law,
9, right? 9 or
9:19. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's Paul walking through here, and it's being all things to all people. But
Yeah.
the final part of it that is so important to me is, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I may win those who are without the law.
So,
So-
verse 21, it says, to
Yeah.
those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. What he's saying is, for those that are in the law, the Jews,
Yes.
he became like them, although he's not under the law of the Jews. But he became like them,
But
so
why-
that way he may win them.
Why isn't he under the law? Because
Because he's under
that's the
Christ.
point that we're trying to
Yeah.
push through here, because of the accomplishment of the fulfilling of the law made us not under the law.
Now, what I like to just caveat all this with, and because I love this conversation. Like, this is one of my favorite things.
I'm just glad we're having conversation.
Yeah. One of my favorite things is because I made the statement, and you all heard me say this, that God gave us the law because he knows how it's worked. He knows how he created things. So we live our best life by fulfilling the law.
Yes.
That's how God created it. So then people say, well, then why don't we still follow the law? Because that obviously makes sense. And I say, you're right. So to be fair, does God say that marriage is between a man and a woman? This is yes, this is no, this is I don't know. I had to do the same
He's
thing
learning,
you did.
yeah.
Yeah.
That gift that God gave humans and gave no other creature in this earth, the gift of choice. It is your decision if you're going to follow this law, if you're going to follow that law.
Well, yes, to some degree, yes. But basically the point I'm trying to make is that we know God created man and woman. So the law says that a man shall be married to a woman, right? So we know that that is God's perfect plan. That's how He created it. That's a lot of the reason why we don't necessarily agree with other, other things that we've already had a conversation about earlier. But the law also says, about drinking, not to drink much and some things like that.
Yeah.
In excess. So again, we all know, we can all agree that if you drink way too much, it's bad for you, right? And you will do stupid things, and you will write stuff on Facebook you probably shouldn't say, and all those things, right? So we can agree that, and the same thing, people talk about, well, I love bacon, I love to eat pork chops, and that's great. But also, you have to realize that one of the most disease-carrying animals there is a pig. And so nowadays in this world we live in, it's very well processed, and and we live in a world now where we can eat it. It's clean because it's been processed. But again, back then, it was a very, very dirty animal, and it would cause disease. So today, even though we are not condemned because of the law, because Christ fulfilled it and died, and we have grace through Christ's death, we are not condemned by breaking the law, but we still live a fulfilling life by following the law. Does that make sense? So if we break it, we have Christ's sacrifice and the dedication that He had to fulfilling the law, so we are not condemned by breaking it, because by that, God is still just.
Right.
God does not lose His justification because Christ absorbed the wrath of God and His.
It was the creation of grace.
Yes, and that's where grace is. So I always tell people, you're still. I mean, if you want to follow the law, that's fantastic.
But we can be so legalistic. The only issue with that is
Yes.
we have people that look at that and they go, oh, we're still to follow that law. And they will be so legalistic
Right.
that they completely bypass grace.
So the law
And it's by
becomes-
grace you've been saved,
right.
not by legalism or obedient to the law.
So for us today, the law is not what we measure our salvation against.
Right.
Grace is what we measure our salvation against. We receive salvation because of the grace that we've received because Christ fulfilled the law. We want to look at the law as a guidebook of the right way to live. It's not a way that we receive salvation.
Right.
Because nobody can follow it. We know that. Nobody can follow the law. But it's still a great guideline to follow because God created it, and it's the perfect way to live. It's the perfect way to have your life.
And that
But we're
law
not
was
gonna fulfill it.
created knowing that the only one who could fulfill it was the
Christ
Messiah,
himself.
which
right.
was Jesus Christ. So, and we're called to live up to try to be as close to being obedient and a follower of Christ to be in His likeness. So, which would mean striving to be obedient to the law.
Yeah. And that's one thing I find so funny is, when you have the people that come and say, well, I don't live under the law, that's legalism, which I know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Okay, I grew up in churches that were legalistic, and they were all about you got to do the right way. And like Charles said, once you become saved, you can't smoke, you can't drink, you can't do this, can't do this, can't do this, all these things.
And you
because
can't
break
go
the
with
law.
girls that do, right?
Yeah, and exactly. And you can't dance, and you can't whatever, right? So all these laws that you can't break, otherwise you don't have salvation. And I've had people now, as I've learned through these things, that when they say, well, we don't live under the law anymore, Christ fulfilled that. I want to say, well, what is our job as disciples? Who are we supposed to mask our lives after on an everyday basis?
The one who fulfilled the law.
Right, Christ. Yeah, we're supposed to be more like Christ. Okay, who followed the law to the letter perfectly? Jesus Christ did. And nobody else. So if, right,
Because we can't.
we can't do it.
Well, we can't.
We just can't.
You said, but when we do, so. Yes. Yes.
We only attain grace through kneeling before God and saying, we realize we did this wrong.
Yes. And it's that grace through faith. The faith in which, and that grace through faith is because we experience grace because of the faith that Jesus fulfilled the law on our behalf.
But only if our faith is true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like you can read this book all day long.
That's right.
Oh, there's a lot of people who have faith that Jesus Christ lived.
I mean, Satan himself
Satan,
knows.
yeah. He got his backside handed to him, and got beat down.
You could go through this whole book back and forth. That does not mean
No,
right.
not at all.
So,
That's right.
you know, be sitting there going, yeah, I know how all this goes. So,
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and like I talked about several weeks back, is that faith is not a faith of going, yeah, I believe he exists, blah, blah, blah. It's a faith of believing that, according to what this says, that there's an action within that faith. As if I told y'all the roof was going to fall in on this building. If you had faith it was really going to fall in, what would you do? You'd get up and get out of here.
Yeah.
So we should have faith that, one, what we read in here to be true, that there's a time coming and so on, and we should have a faith that he is our only salvation. He is our only, and we're called to live in a manner of longing to measure up to him, not others. We'll never measure up to him, but that doesn't mean don't try.
That's what grace is. That's where grace comes in. One of my favorite sayings. There's a singer-songwriter that I really enjoy, and his name is Andrew Peterson. If he's watching, I'm sure
I thought
he's
you were
not.
going to say Weird Al.
No. I hope he's watching, but I know he's not. Anyway, he writes a bunch of really great songs. He writes some really awesome books. But there's a song that he sings, and he's just really good with words. But one of the lyrics in a song, it says, "Not until the bone breaks and you see where it heals, do you ever see the grace." And so what he's talking about is you don't know what grace actually is until you've messed up, right? And you've seen where grace has then healed that in your life. So, again, we never can measure up to the law. There's no way possible to do it. But what makes grace so amazing is that when you have a relationship with Christ and you have that salvation, when you do break the law, how much sweeter is grace in that moment, because you see the effect of grace. You see that I know I failed, but I know the one who didn't ever fail, and now I've got the grace because of his sacrifice.
Well, and in that same direction of going with that, you look at the idea of that we as lawbreakers and through grace, that's where sanctification comes in. Sanctification is actually us being more in a line with God, which is more in a line with his law, which is, and just continue and continue and continue. It's us being sanctified and brought to that place. And so many people, like you said, well, you got to do this, this, and this. No, salvation is through grace. Sanctification and coming more in line with God's law happens through the Holy Spirit convicting you and changing you. Yeah. And that's when you know you are walking through salvation, is when God is changing you, because there's justification, which is when you acknowledge the need of what he did here. You acknowledge the need that he had to fulfill this because we can't do it on our own. Yeah. And then sanctification is allowing him to mold you and make you into what it is he intends you to be. And then glorification. No.
You're being sanctified
until the day you die.
Last your breath.
That's right. And then once you take that last breath, then you experience what? Glorification. You experience a glorified body in glory. So, and that's where people walk through that and they go, well, what does that look like? Well, some people think you got to be sanctified before you can be justified. Nope, that's not what my Bible says.
Yeah.
So because the justification happens because of what we're talking about right now, the fulfillment of the law.
Yeah. God is a just God, and he requires perfection, and through Christ, perfection was met, which absorbed the wrath because of him being a just God. So God is no less just now than he was before, because the law was fulfilled through Christ.
And exactly what was called for was a perfect sacrifice to fulfill that law. And his son was.
If God requires perfection, none of us are perfect.
That's right.
That's why this happened.
You're right.
Scripture says, be holy for I am holy.
Yeah.
We can't be holy in our own.
And
it's simply through the blood of Christ.
We're not quite to that verse yet, but when we get to the end of this, that's exactly what Jesus says too. Unless you can be more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom.
You're jumping ahead.
I know, I'm sorry. But just to answer your question, you're right. You're right. God is a just God. He requires perfection. You're right.
But when we say why bother, then we're belittling what he did, that he fulfilled it. Yeah. We are belittling his fulfillment of it when we go, why do I even care to bother? When we are in that place, then we look at him and go, he was the perfect sacrifice, but he's not worth my time, even though he is my salvation. He is.
Well,
Right. We're not.
nobody is.
None of us are. None of us are. But that's the great thing is we don't have to be worthy.
That's,
He did this so that we could be made worthy through the blood of his son.
because it says why we were still sinners,
Yeah.
Christ died for us. So to me,
Some translations say while we were yet still sinners, and others say while we were still his enemy even.
yes, yeah. That to me, and I've been in that situation. I've had a moment in my life more than once where I've sat there and just felt like there's nothing I can do. I'm
Yeah.
never going to measure up. I'm never going to make it, you know? And so how much more, though, when you get into that position, can you look at what Christ did, what all the suffering he went through, the life he lived, and then you think about it, it's a personal relationship. When they talk about you have a personal relationship, they don't emphasize that word personal.
Mm-mm.
It is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That means he looked at you
Yeah.
and said, I'm doing this for you. He looked at you and said, I'm
Yeah.
doing this for you. If you were I've heard this saying so much, and sometimes it's a cliche, and people say it just
If you were the
to
only
make you get
person.
in the fields. But
Go ahead.
But they'll say, if you were the only person on
Yeah.
earth, Christ would have still died
Yeah.
for you. And while that is true, yet to me, it's so much more personal knowing that he did it for all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, he went through all of that so that way we may all experience salvation. We may all experience his love. I mean, it was an act of love.
And then you
By
go,
Christ.
maybe a good man will die for another good man, but who would die for someone,
Yeah,
I'm trying to paraphrase it, but,
right. You have somebody that's good. I mean, it's easy to die
it's
for
easy to
somebody
die
that's
for somebody that's good, right, but it's not easy
How
to-
easy is it to die for the homeless guy that's sitting on the side of the
Right,
road
to
that
lay
doesn't
down
do
your
anything,
life.
You know?
And here
Yeah.
he is, he lays down his life for his very enemy.
Yeah.
While we were yet sinners, while we were Christ's enemy, he laid down his life to fulfill this so that we did not have to live up to the law, knowing we couldn't. I mean, it's so interesting to me, which once again, Jesus was there in the beginning of time. He actually spoke creation into existence.
That's right.
Some people go, well, Jesus didn't show up till, no, Jesus was there and he actually spoke creation, John 1:1, and you begin to walk through that. But here we have him in the very beginning of what we understand to be the beginning, and walking through this, he put the law out there and went, figure out what that looks like. This is the way you atone for sin.
Sometimes we forget that our sins today were forgiven when he died on the cross.
They were.
Right.
It wasn't today we asked for forgiveness.
Yeah.
It was died before we.
That's right. And because it would not make sense to go with the logic that they bring that up, then it would mean that Christ would have to die
Have
on the
to die
cross
again.
every time you sinned.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it was all crucified on that cross with him.
The power of the blood
Yeah.
is so powerful that it transcends time.
Yeah.
So we could live for 1 billion more years, and the blood of Christ that was shed 2,000 years ago is still efficient for those that are 1 billion years away. Of which, God, please don't let the world last 1 billion years. I'm ready
Come
for
back
it
soon.
now.
Come back soon.
But you know what I'm saying.
That ideal, though, like what I was talking about with him being there in the beginning and here do this, we had to understand that we were incapable of living up to what God wanted.
Yeah.
He knew he was sending his son. I had a guy one time say, and please understand this when I go there, because it's one of those things, some people are like, well, I just don't know about that. But the Trinity's sitting there, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, our creation is going to not be able to make it. This is what we expect. Well, you're going to get to go and pay the price for them. Well, and then you're going to get to go comfort them afterwards. But God knew this from the beginning, from the very moment he created us. And he allowed his law to be put in place so that we would understand the depravity of who we are before him. Yeah. And then salvation came while we were depraved.
Yeah.
And then, thank goodness the Holy Spirit's there, because sometimes he's on one shoulder and the enemy's tugging on the other one, right?
Yeah, we wouldn't make it without the comfort of the Holy
No.
Spirit, for sure.
We better move on. I'm loving that we're halfway through and we're out of time, but we're going to keep rolling a little bit. Are you all right with that? This is yes, this is no, this is I don't know.
Verse 19.
I'm not getting any response. Go for it.
Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Now, I just want to make sure everybody understands this. It does not say they will not enter the kingdom of heaven, okay? It says they will be called the least in the kingdom. Okay?
Your mansion's going to be smaller than everybody else's, okay?
Let's not go there. So I'm going to continue. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So in verse 19, he never says that those that do not teach the law or those that do will be not entering the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
Again, the law and following the law does not determine your salvation. You can't follow it. We have all established, everybody understands, we cannot follow the law. Following or not following the law is not going to determine your salvation. However, whoever relaxes one of these and then commands and teaches others to do the same, they will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. What does that mean? What does it mean whenever you are teaching or relaxing one of these commandments?
When you're doing something wrong and leading somebody else down that path with you, like, hey, you don't need to worry about this law, let's go. That would
Right.
be teaching somebody
Yeah.
else.
Telling them it's okay if you... So again, we have to get in our mindset. We've established earlier that the mindset is the law is there for us to use as a measuring stick of the correct way to live life, not a correct way to get salvation.
Billy, it's okay for you to run around on your wife.
Yeah.
Billy, it's okay for you to get drunk every weekend.
Yeah.
Y'all get that? That wasn't truthful. That
Right.
y'all get what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll get a text in about
Yeah.
5 minutes.
But I know it is. But it's that thing of condoning sin.
Right.
Condoning that and yes,
Yeah.
condoning and spreading sin and condoning and spreading it's okay to live outside of God, outside of God's law.
But then yeah, it'll be okay. You can do it this time.
No. That's why we're called to hold each other accountable. That's why if Billy was in those things, and he's not, Brittany, okay? If Billy was, I can't go, Billy, yeah, I get it. I understand why you are. As a fellow brother, I'm to go, Billy, you're messing up, man.
Yeah.
You're outside of God's will. You're outside of God's law. Yeah, but there's grace.
Yeah.
Well, there's a whole nother area we can go.
Yeah, and there is grace.
Yeah.
And so my salvation, and that's why I said my salvation is not up for discussion in that conversation, right? My salvation is through Christ. I have the grace, but that's not what it's about. What is the law for? It is ultimately the guideline for a correct way of living our life. So again, the sin is there, and there's condemnation for the sin.
Right.
Except he does say there
is no condemnation, yeah.
through Christ.
Yeah.
But the sin is what is in fault there, but not, I've still received grace. I still have Christ. I still believe that. That's just that I have to sacrifice that sin,
Well,
and I have to acknowledge that I am a sinner, and I have to change that about myself.
It
Again,
goes-
this is all hypothetical.
But it also all goes back to the parable of the talents. And that same mindset, you were faithful with these, come and enter into the
Right.
master's.
Right.
And here, does that make sense? Yeah. So that mindset of you were faithful with this, so now this is what you receive.
Right.
That mindset of when he's talking about you will be the least in heaven, that doesn't, I had somebody talk about that one time and they went, I'd rather shine shoes in heaven than be a millionaire on earth.
Oh,
You
my
know.
gosh, that sounds like a televangelist thing.
Well, I don't know if it was or not, but
I
it
bet
probably
it
came
was.
that way. Craig did it. Craig's over there about to sleep. He's like, will y'all finish this? I'm getting hungry. But this ideal, I love this because this right here is a clear depiction to me of what grace is.
Yeah.
Without him fulfilling the law, there is no such thing as grace.
But then again, it's not that if you, those who teaches them, he shall be called great in heaven.
Uh-huh.
Say, you teach and you teach and you teach, and like that old saying, one, oh do-do, you'll mess up a million attaboys.
Yeah.
And it's like,
I haven't heard that in a long time.
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, go out and teach and go out and teach and go out and teach and go out and teach, and then all of a sudden, I make a boo-boo,
Yeah.
and it's like, that just put me to the rest of it.
It's that thing
Yeah.
of looking, well, I get what you're saying,
Yeah.
but it's a little bit different because that's where grace comes in.
Yeah.
But this is saying it's okay to do that.
Christ is, yeah, Christ is not going to look at a life of faithfulness
Right.
and take one mess up and say, oh,
Yeah.
well, there
Well,
goes your
or a
mansion, now
list.
you just have a double wide. Or, you know what I mean? Like,
Hey, a double wide in heaven, man.
that'd be better than a mansion.
It'd
on
be
earth.
good. So
That's our new saying. That's a new
we
saying.
are. But
I'd
the
rather have a
thing that we need to be mindful of is in this longing, in this searching and being obedient. And, we talk about being obedient. Well, why do I have to be obedient if there's grace?
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other story. It's because we're trying to be in alignment with God and be walking with God.
And because
So,
Christ says,
yes.
specifically, even though there is grace, still,
Yeah.
those who relaxes one of these,
Yeah.
is, I mean,
Is when we are seeking and trying, he knows we're going to fall.
Yeah.
It's when we are trying and we're seeking with all of our heart, and there's a conviction of our spirit longing to do better. It's kind of like, I've talked about it several times, when I'm longing to be better today than I was yesterday, each and every day, longing, and I'm longing for that day in which, and I say this, and I always say it, I look forward to hearing it, and I say that, and I don't say that in a manner, or I don't say this in a manner of going, hey, look at me, but I long for one day to stand before my Lord and hear the words, good, well done, my good and faithful servant. I may not hear that, and I'm not worthy of that by any means, but maybe he'll look at me and say that because I'm longing to be that obedient. I'm longing to be that worthy.
and it's like you said, I want to be better today than I was yesterday. But then it's the same time when I mess up today, it's still going in with a heart of this, I don't want to say regret, but I hate that I messed up today and now I have to be better tomorrow.
Well, it's
and
like
know
we talked.
that you still are striving to be.
It's like we talked about mourning our sin.
Yeah.
When we mess up, there's that mourning of, of like the prodigal son mourning the fact of I've failed you, Father.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We don't need to sing that song here. You'll see a pastor ugly cry.
Yeah, for sure. Because you're exactly right. If you think about it in that manner, of again, like I talked about earlier, the sacrifice that Christ made out of love for all of us, we put him on that. Yeah. We put him on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Stop it.
Yeah. Stop it. Because you never will.
But the conviction of your heart because of your relationship makes you long to be.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of like you'll never live up to what Charles expects of you, but you long to try because you love him.
I heard him say that. Can we spread that now, Charles?
Once saved, always saved. So
Oh, goodness. It's
let's
7:06. I don't know
save
if
this
that's
conversation.
Yeah.
Once we are in his hands, we cannot be taken out,
It
yes.
specifically says
But I'm
that
not going to use the words once saved, always saved.
no man can be plucked out of the hand of the Father.
Well, it's 7:06. We're not digging into that right now.
I can have an
We
hour
can have
and
an
a half
hour, yeah.
conversation about that.
Yeah. Wait,
So.
nice one to throw out there, by
Hey,
the way.
you want to kill the...
Yeah, let's close out, and then we will kill the live feed. So I am going to ask Mr. Once Saved, Always Saved to pray us out.